I remember, having a conversation with my brother and just saying, you know what, sometimes when you're in a hole, you just got to stop digging. So we went to China because it was low cost. But now that we're in China, it's actually the most technologically advanced place in the world.
The following is for information purposes only and should not be used as the basis of an investment decision. This is not investment advice. This episode is made possible by Progressive Equity Research, providing freely available, engaging investment research and opportunities to hear from a wide range of small and mid-cap UK-listed companies. In this episode, Julian Collett of Blackdown Partners joins me for a conversation with Simon Phillips, the founder and CEO of CT Automotive, a 50 million market cap AIM-listed company. Simon's journey is a powerful example of how adverse circumstances can be a fertile ground for learning and growth. His story underscores the crucial role of resilience in business success. The development of a business supplying tooling and components to the global automotive industry is testament to Simon's well-honed entrepreneurial skills and can-do attitude, forged in the face of adversity. Growing up in one of London's more socially deprived areas, Simon thrived in maths, physics and engineering, but was thwarted with his dyslexia in pursuing conventional employment. Through successful side hustles developed during his university years, Simon bought into a plastics moulding and tool-making business, becoming MD of his own company at the age of 25. Simon's vision for CT Automotive was clear from the start. He saw the huge potential for manufacturing in China to Western standards. This foresight led him to spend 16 years living in China, transforming CT from its tool-making roots into a global component supply business that serves most of the world's largest automotive OEMs. Simon candidly discusses the challenges he faced in his chosen career path and how he overcame them. He shares why he chose to IPO the business on AIM in 2021 and reflects on the following couple of years as the most challenging he has ever experienced. Looking forward, Simon talks about the need to stay ahead via the adoption of AI and robotics, a trend that is happening so quickly that the shape of the automotive industry he supplies will be unknowable over the next few years. However, as he says, CT went to China for its low costs, but is staying because of its world-class leadership in modern manufacturing technology. This is a fascinating story of resilience, innovation, and raw entrepreneurialism. Please enjoy our conversation with the maverick, Simon Phillips.
Brought to you by Progressive Equity.
Morning, Simon. Thanks so much for joining us today. Can you just tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be running CT Automotive?
I grew up on St Heliers Council Estate in London, which is interesting because from what I'm told, it's still, the largest council estate in the whole of London. And I have a brother who's about 10 months older than me. And my mother had us both when she was quite young. So she was 17 when she had my brother, 18 when she had me. And when we grew up, what I would say is that we were a single parent family. So things were quite tough on the estate over there. But I would say I had pretty fond memories of it, mainly down to the fact that there was lots of kids on the block. And to a certain extent, I suppose life is a bit like that film Stand By Me, where you was always out playing with kids on the common, building crazy stuff, BMXs, ramps, that kind of stuff, and having fun. But what was definitely the case was that it was incredibly tough during that period of time. And my mum was very sort of focused on my brother and I getting a good education. And that education had to lead to us going in some sort of middle class type role, I guess, like a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant or something like that. But she was actually a sort of first generation immigrant from India, from Anglo-Indian descent. When she arrived in the UK in, I'd say, the early 60s, finding herself with two young children, in what was quite a tough background, let's say. I think she did a pretty outstanding job of trying to make ends meet, finding jobs, trying to get us through like an educational system such that we could, I suppose, find a pathway out of life and try and get on, find a better life for ourselves. My brother and I, we were always incredibly interested in anything mechanical. So if it came to like building a bike, repairing a car, building radio-controlled equipment and that kind of stuff, in those sort of really early days, we were very involved with building things, working out electronics, that kind of stuff. So I think that kind of, as sort of Steve Jobs often says, is like how to connect the dots. And if you sort of look backwards, you can see sort of how the dots are formed and I suppose why we are where we are today. The interesting thing is that we went to a school called Glastonbury High School, which I always find quite funny because it sounds a bit like some sort of posh school in the middle of Glastonbury. But actually, it was the school in the middle of the council estate. And, you know, that school itself, it really, particularly in the later years, it became a school sort of synonymous with all the retrobates would be contained in one area. And as a result, the education was incredibly bad there. I mean, they would just teach simple things like foundation courses or CSEs, I think they were at the time. So my mum, being like she was at the time, was like very much, you know, that's never going to get you to become that lawyer or accountant in life. So what we actually did is we dropped out of school a year before the end. And then she went out and she bought us a whole pile of those, what were called like Let's Revise books at that point in time. So we'd end up going to the library and just like reading through these Let's Revise books and then sitting O-levels ourselves. So the interesting thing, I think, the sort of takeaway from that was, I guess at a young age, that sort of need for sort of self-reliance, self-teaching, self-learning, and then sitting exams externally and then passing those GCSEs, which then allowed us to get onto A-levels. You know, if I had to talk about how does that form your character in later life, I suppose, you know, I was watching something recently with where Jensen from NVIDIA was talking about the need for resilience and character building. And I think, you know, when you grow up in a council estate in London with not a lot of money, educating yourself, and also, you know, in the 70s, there wasn't many, let's say, coloured people on the estate. So you have to sort of like deal with the issues relating to that. And, you know, all those things, I think, go on to build a certain strength of character, you could say. One of the first things that really sort of like got me going was the fact that when we were 14, we got our first computer, which was one of the Clive Sinclair Spectrums, if you remember those, complete with the Carmichael speech synthesizer and joystick 2 ports and stuff. I would say for most kids on those computers, it was really all about gaming, you know, the start of gaming as we know it. But for me, I was just entrenched in coding. I learned everything to do with basic, how to write computer games, how to write all my own games, wrote some software for some local businesses as well, using current micro drives to store data. And I'd say that was in some ways slightly transformative too, because it taught you a logical approach to problem solving. And it taught you about, after writing, you know, thousands of lines of code, it was always a question of reviewing that code and then making it more efficient and sort of looking at what you've done and how to make that coding more efficient and the program work better. And that definitely, I think, sets a pretty good mindset sort of going forwards, because it teaches you a real logical way in terms of thought process.
So what about commercializing this logic and this resilience?
In the really early days, I mean, it was simple stuff. Like a lot of the kids who worked who were on the block, you know, at the age of 10, you do your paper rounds and stuff like that. So there was some money coming from there. When I was probably about 14, I remember getting a job at ELS model shops in Sutton. And that was selling things like radio controlled cars, which I was really into, the electronics and how to build them and make them faster. But also they used to have like a test bench at the back of the shop, and often customers would bring in their cars. Maybe they had a slight problem with it, a rheostat on a speed controller that needs cleaning up. Some basic sort of like assembly work to make some money and get things done. But I would say in terms of like commercialization, one of the things that drives you to do that is a need for money. It's one of the most obvious things you need. So when we went on to university, it was really about trying to make money on the side, you could say. So probably my first main business venture that I got into was actually selling stuff on the streets. So buying products, trying to identify what customers wanted and then selling those on the streets. And And that ranged from a whole different bunch of stuff, from 3D posters and different posters to radio controlled equipment that I would buy and import from different countries in Asia, mark it up and then sell it on the streets. And initially I had sort of one stand that I'd do myself, and then I managed to employ a couple of my fellow students and they'd run a couple of the other cities. And that was a real lesson in life in a way, because what I found is that I could almost make in one weekend what people would make in a month. That was kind of a trigger point for me to think, I'm not really sure if like the whole employment route is a way forwards for me. There are ways to make money quickly. And then whilst I was at university, I was generating quite a bit of money in terms of trading on the streets and stuff like that. I went into actually buying properties in Portsmouth when I was at university and renovating them and developing them and then selling them on by bringing in contractors to do some work. So managed to leave university with probably something like £30,000, which at that point in time was like an incredibly high. I couldn't imagine having so much money. So it was a pretty good starting point.
You went to university in Portsmouth. I presume you studied engineering.
I wasn't particularly great at school. And part of the reason behind that was I was dyslexic as a kid. And my mathematics, my programming, my science was great. My written English was pretty appalling. So thank God to Word and all of those things that have come out since that solves problems for people like me. But actually, it's kind of interesting, that the whole dyslexic thing, because, when I looked into it, one of the interesting things is you find, like with entrepreneurs, there's some interesting stats out that something like 75% of entrepreneurs are either dyslexic or slightly on the autistic spectrum. And, I think part of the reason that they become entrepreneurs is because it's not easy to find jobs. If you want to go and work in these big investment banks, lawyers, all this kind of stuff, there's all these tests and it tends to be largely based around verbal reasoning that probably locks you out of a situation like that. So for me, at A levels, I did pure maths, applied maths, physics, all at advanced levels, and then went on to mechanical engineering, which in mechanical engineering, I guess the thing that used to really interest me was like fluid mechanics and transition of oblique shockwaves from subsonic to supersonic speeds. Everything that was sort of mathematical to me was like, I love this stuff. But so having left university, I was actually thinking about two paths right then. It was like, do I go full on in what I'm currently doing? Because actually, I'm making really good money at this. And, if I scale this up, this could be great. But at the same time, I really quite enjoyed engineering. And I know that path wasn't going to take me down the engineering route. So I applied for some jobs. I got a job straight away for a guy called Trevor Brown, who had a company called Atom Technical Mouldings and TV Precision Engineering. It was very interesting working for him because for two things. One, it was the first time, I guess, I came in touch with a slight mentor, an entrepreneur, built a company, an engineering plastics company that was, when I look back on it, relatively small, just maybe a couple of hundred people. But the fact that he used to sit at my desk and he used to turn up in his Jag every day and he'd built this whole company from the ground up, this sort of made me think, wow, that's really cool. He told me stories about how he started from in his garage with a few machines to where he was today. And I thought it was incredibly interesting. So I kept running my side hustle and generating quite a bit of cash on that side and got paid pittance by Trevor compared to, my side hustle. But I was interested in the job. So Trevor went on to sell that company after I was with it for about a year and a half. And, and it was said that he made quite a few millions out of it. And I just thought, wow, this is my next plan of attack. This is, the direction I should be taking next. So I looked around the south coast of the UK, primarily looking for companies similar to what that company was. That was maybe of a similar scale, something where the money that I'd earned so far, I could convert it to equity and take a position in it. So it turned out that there was a company called Solent Technical Mouldings, which was in Hedge End, not too far away from me. And I went and met with the directors. I happened to, at that point, have a reasonable reputation in the industry, even though I'd only been in it a while, because I'd managed to pull some really good business accounts across to Atom in a sort of sales engineering type role. So they were kind of keen on me to try and do a similar sort of thing for them. My stipulation really there was that I wanted to transfer the money that I'd earned into equity. And that was another interesting sort of starting point about like how to put a valuation on a business. that I'm looking at. I mean, it was pretty much transitioned at a sort of net asset basis, and 100 grand at the time had bought me about 27% stake in the company. There was like 3 founders. The chairman was retiring, so he wanted out. He sold me his share. We then sort of went on and we restructured, and by the time I was 25, I found myself as the managing director of the company and operating my first business with like 200 people. I was just like in awe of it. I loved it. I loved looking at a factory. I liked even the trucks that delivered goods, everything, that was associated with it.
Was automotive a major part of the business, supplying the automotive sector, an important part of what you did?
I would say automotive was probably about 30%.
Okay.
But my brother then joined the company, and he was involved with operations and running the factories. He'd come from Delphi, which was an automotive business at the time. And I'd said to him, come on, we got to do this. We can make it a great business. And if anything, it taught us, I would say, to cut our teeth in what was probably one of the hardest sectors there was to be in. And what I mean by that is that really no design engineering capability, very low barriers to entry, a business where you can shift tools around. It's all about price. And whilst it taught us to cut our teeth, I guess, with regards to how processes are done, how tooling's made, how to operate a small business, it was also, I would say, a very valuable lesson in a business never to go into. It was an absolute lesson learned, because it was one of those businesses where it was kind of a business model where if everything goes right, you're going to make a little bit of money. But if everything goes slightly wrong, you're going to lose money hand over fist. And the interesting thing was that this was obviously now into the sort of like the late 90s, you could say, in the UK. And really sort of it was a point in time where manufacturing and globalization was really starting to come rife. And we were there sitting on the south coast of the UK, and we had customers like Kenwood Chefs, Goodman's Loudspeakers, Tambrands, and all these kind of customers. They were all leaving the country in droves. So our pond was getting smaller and smaller and smaller because everybody was going to China, because that's where everything was starting to get manufactured. So I guess the first thing that sort of triggered CT Automotive was that we used to have a small tool shop. So we were building tools in there. And there was one particular customer that we had, and I was always trying to win his development work in his business. And he'd always come back to me and he'd say to me like, sorry, but you're 50% higher than our supplier in China for the development. I was thinking, really, can they really be 50% higher? And then when you go into the sort of breakdown of like a tool in its construction, you actually realize that, it's probably only about 35% material cost. And back in those days when tooling was quite significant in the UK, the overheads and the direct labour and everything else, represents at least the other, 50% or so before you get to profit. So you could see the opportunity in China in that particular marketplace. So I remember, having a conversation with my brother and just saying, you know what, sometimes when you're in a hole, you just got to stop digging. Once you reach that kind of level of realisation, it was just a case of, right, we need to find a buyer for this business and we need to take a different path. At that time, there was a company called the Gencell Group. They were looking at a bigger play within injection moulding in the UK. So they bought the business. We were able to exit a reasonable level of our money out of it, and so then go on a different direction, the direction we wanted to. So the first thing we did is we assembled a whole group of engineers, precision engineers that understood tooling really well. And they were in vast quantities in the UK at that point in time. And we decided that we would do a bit of a recce out to China. We'd already been talking to a few Chinese companies out there. And in the really sort of initial days, our business model was simple. We just thought that the auto industry hates spending money on tooling. I mean, tooling is just a means to an end. If they could make it zero, it'd be perfect. But, half would be fantastic. And then having spent a bit of time the first few months doing sort of some looking around in China, we ended up working with, let's say, a partner out there. Our objective really with that partner is that we will load your front end of sales, and we'll also supply all the engineering design services and reviewing tooling to be able to construct tools to a European standard and ship those tools back to the UK. So that's what we set about. The direction was right, because the auto industry, our clients, we were from STM when we first went to visit them, they loved it because, first of all, they're paying for the tools 40% lower cost. And they're actually getting them in half the lead time as well. because unlike the UK that was working, 8-10 hour shifts, the Chinese companies, they were working 24 hours a day.
How do you then go on to sustain that type of advantage?
We've entered the marketplace, we've recognised a new opportunity, we're the first player opportunity. But the problem is, again, it's very low barriers to entry. So how do you shift the barriers to entry? So what we did is we grew incredibly fast. I think in year 1, couple of million, year 2, probably 5 million. By year 3, we were already up at sort of 10 million. And in terms of tooling revenue, that would have made us one of the biggest in Europe at that point in time. And we were making good money. So what we did is we reinvested the money into our own factory to start with, employing all of our own people. Because one of the problems we found with the Chinese partners that we dealt with was we saw ways to make big improvements, plant equipment, CAD, more sort of European expectations or American expectations in terms of standard quality of finishing and stuff. And we couldn't control the management in a partnership. So it was inevitable that the only way forward really was to establish our own company. And by establishing our own company in China, also to be able to drill down more vertically into the margins that they were making too. And now almost giving us a slight barrier to entry from a perspective that anybody who wants to emulate our model that we've just created now can't beat us from a cost perspective, because actually we've vertically integrated into the ownership of the factory. That's really how CT first started into, let's say, the first 3 years.
How do you establish in China and keep control? Because there are quite a lot of precedents and regulations for having to have Chinese domiciled partners who might mitigate against that. Was that an issue for you?
No, not at all. If the businesses are large, and you're talking, say, an auto company, if they go and set up in China, then it used to be 51% owned by the government, and even other maybe massive brands. But when you're small companies, it's just simply if going to Hong Kong, setting up a Woofy, which is a wholly owned foreign investment company, and then you can immediately set up the Chinese side and you can be 100% ownership. It's no issue.
You're based in Thailand now, and you have operations not only in China, but in other low-cost manufacturing locations.
In terms of then moving to different geographical locations, that was kind of almost customer driven. So, for example, when we opened up the facilities in Turkey, that was really down to Turkish government legislations where they have a certain expectation of built-in content percentage in the car that's made in Turkey. From a commercial perspective, you could say it doesn't actually make a lot of sense. We could have probably manufactured it in China and delivered it to Turkey at a lower price. But it's the fact that it has to have a quite high built-in content percentage in Turkey that drives the requirement for us to be over there. And, more recently, the scenario with Mexico, that's really sort of driven again by the sort of geopolitical issues that are associated between China and America. And then Donald Trump obviously levying that Trump tax of 25%. The 25% really is a high enough number, let's say, that it suddenly starts becoming worthwhile looking at countries like Mexico. Again, really the customer direction in terms of driving the locations. I stepped out of the company for a good I think it was about 5 years. But I wanted to be sort of close to Hong Kong because Phuket's an island with an international airport where you can get a flight within 2 hours. It's on the same time zone pretty much as China and our main manufacturing facilities. It's turned out to be quite perfect because we've also got a big administrative and technical office now in Mumbai. So the time zone there is like an hour and a half behind us. In China, it's an hour in front of us. And then you then follow the sun around the earth for, the UK or Istanbul and the US. The thing that has stunned me is sort of coming back in CT because, when you take a bit of time out, your foot's off the gas a little bit, let's say, with technology. And things like Microsoft Teams makes running global companies incredibly easy to a certain extent. My daily work is sort of split up into time boxes of different meetings that go on Teams. And those meetings tend to be fast, they're efficient. They normally don't take much longer than 30 minutes. And it connects all of us around the world. There can be participants from all over. We're working together on shared platforms, with PowerPoints, with Excels. It feels like you're next to them, really.
You talked about the resilience that you were taught as part of growing up and dealing with the sorts of customers that you deal with that probably is needed in abundance. How did you get your first breakthrough for that big first contract in the automotive industry, which seems like a sort of impossible task.
One thing I'd say with the business we're in now, the barriers to entry are incredibly hard. If I had to go backwards in time, I would definitely be saying acquisitions are best route forwards, because it's a very, very slow burn. And, to give you an example of it, we manufacture many different products now, but if you take vents, for example, that was our first entry point into the auto industry, which surprisingly is one of the harder entry points, but that was our first entry point. And it came about because we used to make the tools, lots of tools, and we made tools for vent companies. And then you'd find out that, for a suite of tools we might make that are £700,000. Back then, TRW that was making these sort of vents, they might be charging $3.5 million for the development process, for the tooling, and the other aspects that go together to develop a vent. And I remember sort of thinking, oh my God, we're just in the wrong business, because we're hunting every day for new business. This tooling, you manufacture it in 6 months, it comes to an end. You're always looking for new contracts. And I was thinking to myself, these contracts, you get brilliant ED&D contract, then you get this 6-year revenue stream that runs on afterwards. But the question was, how do we get into it? It's kind of a bit of a funny story, because back then Nissan were one of our big customers. And I was always sort of saying to them, we want to make vents for you. It makes total sense. They're small, they package well, transportation costs from China is really cheap, they're very labour intensive. We could cut your prices by 30%. Let us make a vent for you. And they were always like, but what have you done in terms of vent manufacturing? And it was like, we haven't done anything, but, we've got the engineering team. I feel we could do this for you. And it's like, sorry, do you know how much it costs an automotive line if we shut down for a minute? It's like $1 million a minute. There's no way. This is a very technical product, engineering, design, testing, all the other things that go on. No chance at all. But we kept on. And in the end, I sort of said to them, look, do you have any problems with any of your vent suppliers? We'll make the tools free of charge. We'll set up all the assembly lines. How do you feel about that? And they'd come back to me and say, look, even if you did all of that, then you've got to work out the supply chain logistics out of China. And what happens, if a ship takes more time, you'll still stop our production lines. And even if you can make the tools, it doesn't mean you can design and develop the next one. So it was like this all the time. But then eventually what happened is they did have a problem with a supplier. And they gave me a call and they said, would you really make all the tools free of charge? And I said, we'll make all the tools free of charge. We'll build the entire supply chain. We'll make all the stock and put it into the warehouse for you to approve. And only then, if you're pleased, give us an order for all the work we've done. So I think they kind of looked at it as a bit of a no-brainer. And they also, I think back then, were experimenting, let's say, with how to reduce costs within a market sector, which was predominantly led out of Japan and Europe. One thing I would say about the business in general is that extremely hard to get in with an OEM or a car company. Very hard. But once we get in with them, we're pretty good at farming the field, let's say.
So from solving that problem for Nissan, you've now supply 20 odd OEMs, or I think it was 18 at the time of IPO, a whole range from luxury to volume manufacturers. How many of those customers over that time period have you lost?
I don't think we have. I can't think of any customers that we've lost over that period of time. What we're trying to do is obviously focus on farming those customers and, driving the business levels up around the world. And, so far today, we've been very successful at it. The RFQ book is like larger than I've ever seen ever. And growth is good. The story, the IPO was always that, up until COVID, which was obviously devastating, the business grew 30% CAGR growth rate for 10 years and good profitability. And then we obviously had that horrendous period across COVID. But now I think we're back in good shape and back onto our historical growth.
Can you just talk about the development of the business and your route to listing and where you are today? There was an MBO transaction back in around 2018. There was obviously the IPO. You had become chairman by then, but returned as CEO last summer.
The company had grown well. It had been very profitable. I'd made a pretty decent amount of money out of it. There was a discussion really of the management wanting to do an MBO. Initially, we would debt fund that through HSBC. I would be part of it. And then more longer term wise, they would buy me down out of the business. And I felt that, I'd been in the sector for 16 years and or even more when you take STM, I was in a pretty good place in life. I wanted to focus at that point in time a little bit more on my family and sort of homeschooling my kid back then. So I just was kind of thought it might be an opportunity to maybe reconsider, do something different. So there was an initial sort of funding for an MBO. I kind of, let's say, stepped away from the business in 16, 17. I think that was also a thought process for me, because I think similar to many entrepreneurs, certainly for my friends too, I find it's like quite binary people. You're either 100% in or you're not. There's no middle ground, really. You don't just dip your foot in. I don't think we're wired like that. I don't think any of us are. You have to be full on in the business. So I decided that actually I'll step out. It's probably the only way to step out of the business. So the management team ran the company on, and obviously now slightly different to how it was historically. It had leverage on the balance sheet. Money had been borrowed from HSBC. And, 17, 18, the trajectory remained great. Profitability was good. I found myself thinking, I should have done this years ago. I stepped out of the business for 2 years and it's still doing fantastic. In 2019, it had a bit of a rough time. There was maybe some issues where the management had lost their way a little bit. They'd also taken the second stage of the management buyout, so they'd leveraged the company a little bit more. And then the worst thing could have possibly happened, of course, in a situation like that, COVID hit. And that just put the company into an incredibly tough situation. So I'd kind of got the call back from the guys in 21 say, things are like really quite difficult. Can you sort of get back involved with the business? And I guess sort of having got involved with the business and looked at that point in time, it was clear that, the balance sheet was well leveraged. They'd taken on COVID loans. They were still nowhere near clear of, let's say, the problems that were still going on at that point in time. And the only way that I could kind of see to, I suppose, rectify the balance sheet, strengthen it up and to give us a fighting chance at moving on was to do an IPO, to raise some capital, pay down some debt, take on some money, and then try and transfer the business back to its normal trajectory.
And how did you find the whole process of IPOing? Was it obvious to IPO in London and use the AIM market?
For me, I'd never done anything like that at all. I suppose any sort of funding we'd historically raised tend to be between normal banks. So going onto the capital markets was a complete insight in some ways for me. And something I found, kind of interesting, to see how it works, how the institutions work, how we interface with them. But it was tough, the IPO. As Julian knows only too well, we were in a sector that, let's say, wasn't doing well at that period of time. COVID hadn't really completely cleared up, and the business was struggling with supply chain issues and let's say chip shortages. So
when we started the roadshow, literally it was the first sort of noises coming from the industry that there was a shortage of semiconductors. I think you were like the last IPO out of the door in 2021.
That's right. No, I think we were. I think, unfortunately, for a lot of our institutional investors who have stayed with us and stuck with the business, they could see the fact that historically this business has been great. It's been impacted by COVID, as did the whole of the auto industry. And really, I think they met some of the management team and they probably thought, this is a company that could continue doing everything that it's done so successfully historically, and assuming they execute well on that basis, then, it could be a good long-term investment. And so, that's our objective. That's what we're trying to do.
We were slightly unlucky after the IPO as well with 2022, because we were expecting that to be a great year, but certainly no deterioration on 2021, but it didn't quite turn out like that, did it?
It was terrible. The car factories, 1 minute they go to work, next minute they're shut down for 2 weeks, next minute they're back to work. And with long supply chains for us, it really meant that we're sending our workers home and paying their salaries, then we're bringing them back and running them at double time and overtime to try and catch up with supply chains. And it was just horrific. No support at all, from the governments. It really impacted the business hard. And then, like Julian said, post-IPO, we were kind of feeling that, COVID's kind of run out. Europe's okay. 21's over. 2022, this is the year, we're off to the races. So we raised enough capital on the IPO to, get us kicked off, only to find it was actually the worst year of any year we'd ever been through. Because what happened is, of course, Omicron went rife and a pandemic spread all the way across the whole industry. if you're next to somebody, you don't have to turn up for work. So auto companies started going down again for a while. And that only lasted around about a month. And then the auto company said, you know what, we don't care. If you've got COVID, still come to work. And then, of course, Russia invaded Ukraine. And as a result, it turns out that Volkswagen Audi Group supplying harnesses are all built in Ukraine. That slowed Volkswagen Audi right down, which was a major customer of ours, impacting us over there. That triggered hyperinflation on energy and impacts on businesses around the world, and also drove container rates up from $4 to $20. And then just as we were able to try and overcome all of those problems, China then pops its head up and says, well, actually, we've never had COVID, but we have now. So we're going to go on a full lockdown and you can close your factories for 20% of this time. So it was just awful. It couldn't have gone any worse. But what I would say is that behind us, it was a terrible year. We did a fundraise, our investors supported us. I think 23 showed a start of capability, what the company's capable of. And I think 24 is much better. And by 25, I think we're absolutely firing on all fours.
Every day you open the paper, there seems to be something relating to the auto industry, whether it's the transition to EVs, whether it's trade tariffs, 100% tariffs on Chinese manufactured vehicles, or changing legislation one way or the other in some other major economy.
I mean, the auto industry, there's no question, is in flux. I mean, there is a big change going on. The outcome of which I think, if you looked, let's say, long-term wise, no doubt points to EVs from a technology, mainly because of the digital control systems that you can apply to EVs. And let's say the implementation of AI and full self-drive systems, which is coming up incredibly fast. It's not the kind of stuff you can do with gas cars. The issue we have, I think, in the auto sector at the moment with EVs is that it's a sector that's still at its very sort of early adoption stage. It's almost like all technologies that you see that go through that sort of S-curve growth phase. And it's probably still at the bottom end of that S-curve. And the issue when you're at the bottom end of the S-curve, I think, with deploying any levels of new technology, is that it's rapidly changing. And that presents its own problems, because I think for people who want to go out and buy an EV now, the issue that they're seeing is obviously the residuals are worthless. They're incredibly low. And that's partly because, for the first time, what we're seeing in cars is almost, in a way, what you'd see in a laptop or a mobile phone. In 3 years' time, the software's better, the hardware's better, the battery life's better. So, how many people go out and buy a 3-year-old laptop? You don't do it. You want the one with the battery that's going to last now 2 days with the latest software and this kind of thing. And so in the earlier sort of adoption phase and technology rollout, you've got companies obviously like CT that I think are well known to be the major manufacturing battery company in the world, both from a technological point of view and also in terms of output of lithium-ion battery packs. It just seems to me that every 3 months they're coming up with a better chemistry, a chemistry that maybe can provide far better energy density into the cells. Another is overcoming let's say, the insurance claim aspect, because, these are effectively almost like skateboards on wheels with a battery pack below. And part of the problem you have with that is that crash impacts. I mean, when you're dealing with lithium ion, which is, inherently unstable, let's say, as a chemistry, you cannot take risks with battery packs and impacts in cars. So relatively small impacts could lead to significant cost write-offs on cars.
And what about the impact of the $10,000 Chinese EV? It's a hot political potato that the US seemed to be determined to prevent.
The last time I heard, there's 450 EV players in China, of which I think, off the top of my head, 3 are profitable. Most of them are losing money like there's no tomorrow. And this is a classic sort of China story to a certain extent. I mean, I've seen it many times before sort of play out, even when I lived in China for 16 years. I mean, an example of which is like somebody comes up with a great idea that I'm going to generate an app to a push bike that you can go up and click and ride around on the streets. Next thing is you see like a whole bunch of orange bikes on the pavement.
Yes.
2 months later, you see orange bikes, blue bikes, yellow bikes, and the whole pavement, you can't walk on it anymore. Everybody's piled in. They've raised cap money on the markets and they've all piled in. And the net outcome of it is that all these bikes are now sitting in a metal dump in the middle of a field and nobody wants them. They're just totally oversupplied. So China's in a situation where it's in a mass oversupply to demand. So it's a bloodbath going on out there like you can't imagine. And the only way out for them is to export into the foreign market. So tariffs are one thing, but if you look back historically in the auto sector, brand is very important too, within the car companies. You look back at the days of when the Koreans first came or the Japanese first came, it takes 10, 12 years to build brand value in a marketplace. So there's time to adapt to the Chinese. I think what you might start to see happen is you might see that a lot of, let's say, the legacy automakers that are still running cash cows in IC cars in Europe and America, you might find that they're looking a little bit from the outside at letting the Chinese do a lot of the technological development at a very fast rate. And it wouldn't surprise me if they start buying assets of companies that are in serious trouble. And there's so many of them in China at the moment that are in difficult situations. What I would say is that you cannot underestimate the Chinese by any way, imagination at all, because they are an incredibly hardworking, innovative bunch of people. And I think when you look at stories like BYD, Li Auto, those kind of companies, Geely, what they've done with Volvo, car companies like that, you cannot underestimate them. They have a work ethic and an innovation that blows Europe and America away. So they are a big threat for the future, for sure. Let's be honest, the main thing that sort of keeps me awake at night is really the constant thought process of AI and how that's applied to the industry sectors that we're in. I don't know how much you use it. I actively encourage our whole workforce to be more focused on utilizing things like Copilot, ChatGPT, incorporating AI into our manufacturing systems, whether that's visual quality recognition systems or even the sort of robotics that we're working on. I guess the reason why it keeps me a bit awake at night is because I use things like ChatGPT all the time. And these days I see that a large language-based neural network electronic brain model that's performing with an IQ of like 170. If you think, well, where does that trajectory go? By the time I'm sure GPT level 5's out, it'll be, they think, a magnitude of 10 greater than that. Seems to be happening every 6 months. And, if you look at the applications of how we as a business are using things like GPT and AI, it goes right the way across from whether it's legal to accounting to spreadsheet manipulation and data understanding to design engineering and the application of reviewing designs and considerations. And I think, funnily enough, I was watching a TED talk just the other day with Mustafa Suleyman, who was the person who developed Google DeepMind and, considered to be one of the main AI people in the world. And I think the concern is that in the next 3 or 4 years, I don't think that we will be able to comprehend what is capable of being designed, because you're probably dealing with something with an IQ level at, say, 700, operating tens of thousands of times faster than we can. So that's almost like me talking to my dog over here, Dixie, and asking, can you design an air vent or a car for me?
So I was just about to say, they'll treat us as pets, won't they?
So, when I was talking earlier about sort of connecting the dots, so we went to China because it was low cost. But now that we're in China, it's actually the most technologically advanced place in the world. So now we're using China more for incredibly skilled people, robotics, implementation of AI on like vision systems and that kind of stuff. I'm driving this business into a direction of incredibly high digitization, right the way through from electronic orders coming in from customers through to complete supply chain management to goods being manufactured and out the door. And I think for me, across the next year within the business model we've got, is to become so technologically advanced that our competitors can't touch us, which is a real spin on the head from the comparison of like trying to do it because it's a low cost operation. How I kind of look forwards into the next 5 years is that there will not be any LCCs, low cost economy. So it won't be as Africa next, as Morocco next, because what it's going to be implementation of automation and low cost robotics that could be built anywhere in the world. So we've actually got a team dedicated within CT to just do nothing other than looking at automation, robotics, application of AI.
So you've just made my next question completely redundant, because I was going to ask you what the company will look like. What's your vision for the business and what it's going to look like in 10 years' time?
We are looking for absolute digitization and automation. And we are trying to do it at a faster rate than any of our competitors, much faster.
What's the biggest constraint on that? Is it having the right people, the right culture? It doesn't sound like it's a capital problem.
No, because this is one of the major advantages of us being in Shenzhen, which is, the tech capital of the world, isn't it? We've got great access to like 6-axis robots, to vision systems. We've built our own team for internal design and engineering of automated assembly cells and stuff. So CapEx is not stopping it. It's not just the automation, let's say, of the assembly cells itself, but it's the full connectivity of ERP systems into AI and just taking cost down, driving cost down both in terms of overheads and directs and indirects on the labour side too, so that you can position yourself at like the most competitive position you can possibly be in. And I don't know any of our competitors that are prepared to run at the speed we are. I'm literally on calls all the time, every day of the week, and I'm stunned by it. I find it fascinating, the level of things that we're doing in the business. So for us, it's all about driving efficiencies and driving cost to the lowest possible point. And right now, that has pivoted away from LCCs, low-cost economies, and is very much in a digitization world and an automation world. And that is what we are focusing on becoming sort of leaders at, which kind of makes us become more sort of technologically based than what we used to be. But we've built teams to do it, and it's exciting. The things I see on a daily basis of the assembly cells we're building and the levels of automation is just really great.
What would you say have been the biggest mistakes you've made along the way, and what have you learned from them?
I think you really need to put a lot of focus and effort into building the team around you. That may have been a slight underestimation for me historically. It's all about finding absolute A players, people that are driven, people who are 24/7 type people that are passionate about what they do. I think if you have those kind of people around you all the time, then, you can do amazing things.
That's great. Simon, it's been a pleasure talking. Julian, thanks for your insights and perspective on the conversation. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sharing so much with us, and look forward very much to following your progress with great interest, and hopefully catching up with you again in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Jeremy.